We sometimes talk or are talked to about efficiency dividends like they're minor maintenance, a 1% haircut here, a 2% trim there. But those small nips and tucks stack up year after year and quickly become something else. They become a trajectory. And if we don't plan for how steep that trajectory is, it's easy to kid ourselves that we can avoid changing anything fundamental. We try to hit our targets by holding our breath and hoping. Holding your breath might even work for a year, maybe two, but it's not a long-term strategy. Maybe you can save a bit by freezing employment, leaving roles vacant as people move on naturally over time. That can work in the short term, but quickly leaves you with random gaps determined by who happens to leave, not the capability and capacity you need in the future. Maybe you can save a bit more by deferring planned upgrades or maintenance of systems, facilities, and equipment. That can also work in the short term, but quickly leads to more failures, downtime, and remediation costs. It also denies you potential gains from using better tools. These kinds of short-term savings tactics are attractive because they reduce costs without too much resistance, at least for a while. But they're not sustainable. Over time, they change the nature of the organization in ways you didn't intend. You end up spending a bigger share of a shrinking pool of funding on things that don't contribute to your core mission, which is the reason you're funded. Pretending we can keep doing more with less year after year temporarily masks the real cost of underfunding core priorities, but ends up passing that cost with interest on to future taxpayers. Gaps get bigger, so do risks, and eventually they start to line up. When we squeeze everything all at once, eventually something blows out. The incremental approach can have damaging effects. Like the Swiss cheese effect. There are little holes in each layer of a complex system, but as long as those holes don't line up, everything is okay. As we stretch a little further every year, we get more and bigger holes that are more likely to line up until serious failures start to slip through. More things go wrong, and go wrong in a big way. When that happens a few times, we pile new demands onto already overstretched systems to respond to coronial inquests, public outcry, and royal commissions. You might get a temporary spike in crisis resourcing, but it takes a long time to rebuild muscles that have atrophied. And it takes far more resources than the small changes saved towards incremental targets. Then there's the waterbed effect, where if you lean on one part of the bed, it expands elsewhere. Squeezing spending on consultants and contractors, for example, would normally lead to a cost increase elsewhere, like permanent staff. The work, or water, has to go somewhere. But when we're cutting headcount at the same time, maybe by natural attrition, to squeeze out incremental savings, we're leaning on both ends of the bed. At this point, waterbeds spring leaks or burst, which is exactly what happens to publicly funded organizations. We try to cut consultants and headcount and fund pay rises all at the same time and end up with too little capacity to deal with far too much work. These are not efficiency gains, they're structural risks. What if, instead of slicing our cheese ever more thinly and frantically patching our mattresses, we just stop pretending we can hold our breath forever? What if, instead, we said we need to save 15% or 20% of our costs over several years? How? The answer to that question obviously isn't deferred maintenance or unfilled vacancies, especially when we've already been holding our breath for years. On that scale, the only viable answers are to fundamentally reimagine our operating model and scope. It's impossible to pretend that back office efficiencies will somehow save us when the target is bigger than the back office. 20% is not a haircut, it's an amputation. Start by estimating the real target, which is always more than the net saving target. Big productivity gains need investment in new ways of doing things, new tools, and new capabilities. That's not free. It's not even cheap. So assume a sensible implementation budget to manage big changes and realize big savings. Then risk weight the total. Not all big ideas are big winners. You'll need to account for delays, resistance, unexpected costs, and lower than expected benefits. The bigger and more radical the change, the bigger those risks. Now, express the adjusted target, which will be even bigger and scarier than the number you first thought of, in the base unit of your biggest costs, which are usually labour. How many teachers or nurses, police officers, firefighters, food safety inspectors, train drivers, or whatever would we need to do without? You might get some gains at the margins, but a target well into double digits will always affect core business. Now ask, how could we redesign our model to work under those constraints? That's a very different conversation, even though we're still talking about the same couple of percentage points a year. But now it's obvious that we can't just trim around the edges. We need to rethink how we educate our children or heal our sick, keep our communities safe, fight fires, transport our commuters, and trust our meals. That's no longer an internal administrative problem. It's a bigger, grown-up conversation for executives, governments, and citizens. When we stop pretending we can hold our breath forever, we're forced to face the underlying tension of balancing infinite wants with increasingly finite resources. That will mean some robust debates about costs and revenue and publicly funded services. And that's hard, really hard, but probably not harder than fronting a Royal Commission. Plan efficiency targets as a cumulative multi-year program, not a budget-to-budget squeeze, because compounding fractions really add up, and holding your breath is not a long-term strategy for publicly funded services to survive, let alone thrive. Working towards big goals progressively, or at least not working against them with short-sighted cuts and deferrals, is a better way to sustain a resilient, purposeful organisation that's ready for the future and not just barely clinging on. Thank you for watching.